Yo, what's up and Happy New Year. We did it. We got around the sun one more time without dying. But the question remains, who will make it around again and who won't? The suspense is killing me. LOL. Hey, Happy New Year, everybody. This time of year, I'm actually listening to a ton of new music. There's some websites that I'm pretty loyal to around the Christmas holidays. Pitchfork, Sputnik, and Stereo Gum, they all release a top 50 albums, and I check those out. I see what's interesting to me, and I find cool new music. Just some suggestions if you don't know about those. It's a really good starting place to find good music. But for right now, let's talk about some stupid stuff that us Christians do. Or should I say, what we say. So let's start this new year right and stop saying stupid Christian stuff. So let me give you one example that I wrote down recently. Have you ever heard a Christian pray that God would show off? or if you think God did something good, you say, God, thank you for showing off. So if you have no idea what I'm talking about, you're lucky, but most of you know what I'm talking about. So let's take a little second and consider this. When God does something good, he's showing off. Like, why does God need to show off? Is God insecure? Did God not get the affirmation that he needed growing up as little God to big God? Like, let's think about the second member of the Trinity, Jesus. He came down to earth to show off. Like, all of his miracles were just him being a show off. So now, bottom line, if you talk this through with someone who says something stupid like this, they probably in actuality aren't ascribing like that sort of meaning to their statement. But can't we stop saying it? Like, can we at least be vigilant and make sure we don't say things so preposterous? Did I say that word right? I hope so. But I mean, it's just my opinion. So I am clowning right now, but I also have some real feelings about this. My personal opinion, it just feels and sounds disrespectful. So I'm about to personally show off because I have an episode that I didn't plan on having. That I'm such a good podcaster, I accidentally podcast. So I actually see this as an episode to wrap up 2021 with. It falls more into the category of a bonus episode. Let me tell you how it unfolded. So I haven't talked about this much, but some of you remember that I'm going to produce a podcast for the church I've been with for 20 years. And I already recorded a conversation for it, even though it won't hit until after Easter. But the episode I already did was Shane Claiborne and Jack Hoy, the daddy. For new listeners, there's a Jack Hoy dad, there's a Jack Hoy son. This is the dad. And they're talking about whether or not Christians can live in accordance with God's will while acquiring great wealth. So if you don't know Shane, I'll tell you, he's a very dear guy who has some very radical approaches to this question. He parts with most of his income to benefit the well-being of others. Jack, on the other hand, also a dedicated Christian, is very, very generous. You'll hear in a second. Actually, you won't. Because it won't be on this podcast. Very generous, but he believes that acquiring wealth can be exactly what God would want us to do alongside generosity. Anyway, it was great having both of these guys at the crib. So after our discussion, Shane, and you could tell this was like out of real conviction, he wanted to speak about some things about my home state of South Carolina, where we're all at that moment. I had no idea of this, but our state is a hair away from bringing back a firing squad as means of execution. You heard that right. According to Shane, the firing squad for a means of capital punishment, that squad is already assembled. WTH, man. So anyway, all this said, Shane wanted to talk about this too, in addition to the wealth thing. So we agreed to do an additional interview for Pastor with No Answer. So I'll tell you something funny that you're about to hear. We talk about the current climate of South Carolina with all this ready, aim, fire stuff, but we also take the opportunity to discuss the moral basis for capital punishment in general. I started this interview with giving Shane a rundown of my journey with all of this. And damn it, if this podcaster of 7 years forgot to push the daggum record button. So I'm going to include my analysis right here in the intro in a second, my journey of capital punishment, and then we'll pop right into the conversation with Shane right after I had realized I wasn't recording. So I'm excited about this new year of podcast. I'm going to introduce you to some more of my friends, co-hosts. Got some cool shows coming up. Also, this year we'll open the door for folks to join my online community. It's a community that focuses in on people that need family. It's all online, and people that need some more spiritual footing for their faith crisis or deconstruction, or they just want to be around people thinking through some similar stuff. But we also want people in there that aren't thinking similar stuff. So we have some, pretty more fundamentally wired folks. We even have a couple of people that don't even believe in God anymore. So looking forward to presenting that to you. And I know a lot of you will find a cool new home. Next week, the official start of 2022 PWNA will be Chip Judd. You guys know who that is. And he gets to hear a case for universalism that A, doesn't question Jesus's divinity, B, doesn't minimize the necessity of the cross. So we have Sharon Putt, I think it is. I know that her former name was Sharon Baker, but I should have just looked this up real quick. I think it's Sharon Putt, formerly Sharon Baker, who wrote the book Raising Hell. She has quickly become one of my favorites. I just think we're so alike, our religious background, how we've changed, how we see people over positions and outlooks. But she's older than me and way further along on the wisdom road than I am. So I love any second I get to talk to her, and that'll be next week. But for right now, here's my journey on capital punishment. So you guys, not sure if you know, I grew up Catholic, and then we went from Catholic to Pentecostalism. And I remember being at a Pentecostal church. I was in youth group, and I had never heard any perspectives on capital punishment. I've never heard the debate. I just assumed that killing someone for doing something really bad was just not in accordance to Jesus' will. That's just kind of where I was at. I even wrote a paper on it in high school that my liberal teacher just loved. But then as I started looking into this, I realized my family of fundamental evangelicals saw this a whole hell of a lot differently than I understood it. And what I was arriving at, they weren't arriving at. And I get it. I'm not diminishing that perspective. I understand where it comes from. But I'd personally say that as a Christian, I'm not behind the death penalty. But I also don't really have this mentality of a country's government needing to be a Christian government. That doesn't make sense to me. That's why, amongst many other reasons, I don't like the Christian nation thing. What does that even mean? So like our country was at a revival with other fellow countries and came up for an altar call and gave its life to Jesus. So we get into all this with Shane, and I hope you enjoy. Hey, real quick. So this is sincere. I sincerely won't be offended if you don't do this, but I certainly would be appreciative if you do. Spotify now has ratings for podcasts. It's very new, and I'd love for you, if you listen to this podcast on Spotify, just take a couple of minutes and rate this podcast. I'll be your best friend. Not really, but I will appreciate it. Love you guys. Enjoy. Oh, gosh. Well, if anything, I feel awful because now I have to go my little monologue again. All right, I tell you what, I remember my monologue. Like, seriously, I'll be able to do that, so I apologize. Why don't you pretend like I just said all that and then respond? Please forgive me.
No. So the interesting thing is that the death penalty has survived in America, not in spite of Christians, but because of us.
Yeah.
The Bible Belt is the death belt.
And real quick, just so for clarity, when you say Christians or believers or whatever, I come into contact with a lot of people who say, yeah, I go to church. I'm a Christian, of course. And I'm not judging them, but I also know that that's about as deep as it goes, where when you say Christian, do you mean someone who has heard the gospel, accepted it, and say, hey, I want to live that way too?
I think it's absolutely both. So, For instance, in my home state of Tennessee, Bill Lee, the governor, is a Christian. He goes to church on Sunday. And then he's executing people by electric chair in Tennessee. And so I know the guys on death row in Tennessee. I've been visiting them for years. My mom's been, my wife's been, so I know a lot of these guys. And they, some of them maintain their innocence. Others are very clear about the guilt of what they did. And they've fallen in love with Jesus. They're different people than they were 20 or 30 years ago. And half of the men on Tennessee's death row have invited Governor Lee to just come pray with them and listen to the story of what Jesus has done in their life, you know? So there's states like these Bible Belt states that are the states where the death penalty continues to hang on. Texas, Governor Abbott in Texas is Catholic.
Right.
And so that's half of the executions in our country. And so South Carolina is one of those that's trying to bring the death penalty back after about 10 years without an execution. And now with the firing squad. So you've assembled a firing squad.
Oh my gosh.
And the electric chair in Tennessee. So I think a little bit of the backdrop of this is helpful. So executions have been dropping almost every year. They're the lowest they've been this year in like 20 or 30 years. New death sentences are the lowest they've been in a generation. Almost every year a new state abolishes the death penalty.
Dang.
But there's, America's polarized. So there's pockets of folks that want to bring back the firing squad. They want to bring back the gas chamber and the electric chair in Tennessee. So what's interesting is that this is also tied to some of our racial history, right? So we're in South Carolina, right? And being in Tennessee, we just took the statue of Nathan Bedford Forrest, the founder of the KKK, out of our capital, right? Where
he was the founder of the KKK, and there's a statue in the Capitol
until this summer.
Good
Lord. So the states that have held on to the death penalty the longest are the same states that held on to slavery the longest.
Wow.
And that history is very important. Like where lynchings were happening 100 years ago is precisely where executions are happening now. And Virginia this year became the first formerly Confederate state to abolish the death penalty. So that was a big deal, you know? So that you can't kind of talk about the death penalty separate from our racial history, like as we move from lynching African Americans to like legal executions, Black folks were like about 10% of the population, but they made up 75% of our legal executions were African Americans. And you fast forward and we've come some ways, but you still see that this is one of the clearest places you can see the residue of racism and slavery, So African Americans are still half of death row and over a third of the executions. And it's really clear that what determines who actually dies is not the atrocity of the crime, but it's the resources of the defendant, and it's arbitrary things like the race of the victim. When the victim's white, it's much more likely to be a death penalty case, especially if the defendant is a person of color.
So you're saying there's no, like on paper, if you do the research, there's no correlation between the crime and whether or not someone is sentenced to death. Like there's just not a whole lot of it. It's mainly the person's upbringing and their income and social economic status.
Well, so Jeffrey Dahmer didn't get the death penalty.
Right.
Charles Manson died in prison. The Unabomber, Ted Kaczynski, is still alive, right? And these are all white folks. Ted Kaczynski went to Harvard. And I'm not saying I want him killed.
Right.
I'm saying that we kind of are conditioned to think we're killing the worst of the worst.
Right.
But the truth is, we're killing the poorest of the poor and disproportionately people of color. And it is those arbitrary things. Like it's more like a lottery, like of who actually gets executed. I mean, the zip code of where you commit the crime has a lot to do with it. The, the resources that you have to defend yourself, all those things play, a really big role in it. But I do want to go back just a minute to say, like, this is not just a political issue, though. I begin to really recognize that this is a spiritual crisis. That the more I looked at the death penalty and why I wrote a book, Executing Grace, on it, was because I saw that when we think about the death penalty, it raises some of the most fundamental questions of our faith and theology. Like, is anybody beyond redemption?
Right.
Do we think that God's grace is big enough for even someone who's murdered? And not the spoiler alert on this, but Moses killed somebody, right?
Right.
David killed Uriah.
Right.
Saul of Tarsus was a terrorist, right, before he found the love of Jesus. So like we have this.
But weren't all those? I'm pretty sure the only one I can't speak. Well, no, all of them. That was more of a Moses for sure, and Paul. That was more of a unjust. We're angry. So we're going to use our power to kill you. I think, and you and I are on the same page when it comes to capital punishment, but I think most Christians who are pro capital punishment would say, hey, it's not like some mad people going after innocent people. It's actually people who have done really bad things. Like, don't you think they have this put in their brain a lot differently than that?
Well, first of all, I was one of those folks
right.
that
Me
defended
too.
the death penalty, right? I was convinced that it was ordained by God, and then that's when I started looking at it a little closer, and I mean, there's so many things that you start to see. First of all, because I'm a big believer in the Bible. Like I want to do good theology, and so I've gone back and looked at a lot of those. I mean, even the inaugural murder, Cain and Abel.
Yeah.
God doesn't kill Cain. God actually marks and protects Cain. The murder has consequences, and murder should always have consequences. He's exiled, but he's protected and allowed to live, and eventually allowed to have a family and build a city. And the same with Moses. You kind of look at this trajectory, but yet for a lot of folks, what eclipses all of that is the idea of an eye for an eye, a tooth for a tooth, a life for a life, and it's one of the most well-known Bible verses in the world. Right?
We love that one.
Yeah.
That one, and don't judge us.
and yet, when you look at it, we've kind of distorted it. And some of my Jewish friends have helped me with this. They said this was not a license for revenge. It was a limit. It was to actually de-escalate a spiraling situation of violence, just like we see all the time. And so it set a limit to how much you could retaliate. In fact, the law in the Old Testament is called lex talionis. It's where we get the idea of retaliation from, and it allowed reciprocal harm. You could harm someone in as much as they had harmed you. So we might think like an eye for an eye, no more. If you broke my arm, I could break your arm, but I couldn't break both your arms and go burn down your mother-in-law's house, or something. So like it kind of set a limit, and then you start to think, wow, that's pretty beautiful that the goal was to like stop violence. And so then when Jesus comes, and says, you've heard it said, an eye for an eye, a tooth for a tooth, but I tell you this, Moses told you this, but I tell you this, that it's not negating that, it's fulfilling it. Come on, somebody, right?
Yeah.
And so like the fulfillment of that is you might legally have the right to hurt someone back, but that doesn't mean you should. And I think that's where Jesus really transcends this idea of reciprocal harm and shows us that what's really going to heal the wounds is not creating more. And we know that deep down. I mean, like, come on.
Right.
If you poke my eye out, I don't think many people listening to this are going to think that the best justice we can do is actually to gouge your eye out.
Right.
We don't rape people who rape to show that rape is wrong, but somehow in the most extreme case of murder, we're still doing it, right? We're killing to try to show that killing is wrong.
Yeah, and I don't want to spend too much time on this part, but what do you do theologically, though? Because you either have to, it seems like you either have to say people weren't hearing from God in the Old Testament, or you'd have to say something along the lines of, God changes. God was not moral back then if he asked for this to, like, what do you do theologically? Because most people would say, how could you say it's wrong? God commanded it. It was in God's law. And even if that law was changed and Jesus fulfilled it all, you still have to put God on the hot seat and say, well, why did you ever command that?
Well, so back to my Jewish friends, one of my rabbi friends says that we had all of these prohibitions. And by the way, capital murder was not the only death-worthy crime, right? There's over 30 death-worthy crimes, right? Working on the Sabbath was one. I always go, everybody but Chick-fil-A would be in trouble on that, But like disrespecting your parents, sorcery, even in the United States, we've evolved in our thinking. We had the Salem witch trials. We had all kinds of crimes that were capital crimes that aren't anymore. So I think it's helpful to think that we've evolved, but part of why we justified that was by misusing the Old Testament to say, but my rabbi friends had said, we also had over 40 qualifications for what needed to happen in order for an execution to be carried out. So what they did was they made these really strict declarations that this is so important to preserve community, to protect people. But then the prohibitions were there. Even circumstantial evidence wasn't allowed. You had to have 2 eyewitnesses that agreed on every single. So they said there was almost never an execution. The rabbis used to say, if we have more than one execution in 70 years, something's wrong. It's a bloody court. And something's sick in our society, right? So it's interesting that they had the death penalty, but they almost never used it. And to this day, Jewish folks are, all my Jewish friends, rabbis and stuff, are baffled. They go, the irony is, it's Christians that are misusing the Hebrew scripture to justify the death penalty. And then he goes, and you guys have Jesus to reconcile this with. And so that's where I, just finally say that Jesus is the full revelation of God, as scripture says. So like now Jesus becomes the lens through which we're interpreting scripture, right? So when something doesn't sound like Jesus, like let's dig deeper, let's figure it out. But I really believe that even in this case, Jesus is not negating that law, he's fulfilling it. And he's showing us the perfection of God's love. So stopping violence or limiting violence was a good place to start, but then not even mirroring that violence is where we're in tonight.
Right.
Yeah.
It's interesting in any conversations along these lines. I do think of movie scenes, and one of my top 25 movies for sure is The Green Mile. And, basically it's the whole thing is based out of a death row in a jail back in the 1940s or something like that. But when you see these scenes of families of victims coming to witness an actual execution and hearing them say, burn them twice, and, kill that pervert and all that stuff. I remember Priscilla and I watching a movie like that and just it's so heavy. It's like, you understand where they're coming from. The guy just raped and killed your daughters, but how they're expressing themselves and their posture and where their heart's at is not good for that person. It never will be. It's not going to end anywhere well. And so for me, it's just seeing where that conviction to punish people, it's coming from a really, really dark place. Real dark place.
Dr. King said that capital punishment is society's final assertion that we will not forgive.
Wow.
It's a powerful statement. And I mean, that obviously flies in contrast with Jesus, forgiven as much as you'll be forgiven, like that. But I think it's important to say that to be against the death penalty is not to be against justice, and to say that murder shouldn't have consequences or that we don't care about victims. Like, I care deeply about murder victims and victims of violence. It's part of why I'm doing a lot of work on gun violence and stuff. But the death penalty doesn't heal the wounds. It just creates new ones. It extends trauma. It just kind of exacerbates the wounds. It mirrors the evil, right, that we're trying to heal the world of. And so it's why I think some of the most credible voices in the movement for alternatives to the death penalty. And by the way, we've got a whole statewide movement here in South Carolina called South Carolinians for Alternatives to the Death Penalty. But folks like Sharon Risher, Reverend Sharon, her mother, Ethel Lance, was killed in Emmanuel AME. Her 2 cousins were killed, her childhood friend, and she walked away with that, with all kinds of emotions. She's a hero of mine, and we've become really good friends over the years. I'm sure initially there's all kinds of things she wanted for Dylan Roof, but eventually she and many of the other family members, they said, Dylan Roof doesn't need to be killed. Killing's a problem, not the solution. Dylan Roof needs Jesus. He needs a jail cell right now. I think he's imminently dangerous. But don't we all hold out hope? Reverend Sharon would say this. Don't we all hold out hope that God's love is bigger than Dylan Roof's hatred? Right. Come on, right? Yeah. Like that grace can get the last word. And so and those voices are all over the country. My friend Suzanne Bossler, her dad was a pastor who was killed, and she walked away really convinced that her dad wouldn't want the death penalty, and so it was just one story after another going, we can honor the victims of violence without more violence.
Right.
You know, and I think that's why, being here in South Carolina, I've been thinking about that a lot, with the firing squad now. And, I don't know if you know this, Joe, but in the traditional firing squads, I bet this will be the case in South Carolina. There really is a blank bullet. I mean, that's kind of like this folk legend.
Really?
They call it the bullet of conscience because everyone wants to walk away feeling like maybe they didn't kill someone. And this is something, right? Because you think like there's something in us that knows that killing is wrong. And that's why we kind of create this sort of sterilization and we have multiple layers of everybody like kind of having a piece of the responsibility of killing someone. But the reason I thought this was just sickening was that they redesigned the blank bullet recently because it didn't have enough kick and the person could tell if they had the blank bullet.
Oh my
God. They redesigned it so it actually feels like a real
That is so interesting.
bullet.
Wow.
But all that to say, like, I when I wrote Executing Grace, I interviewed executioners that are now against the death penalty.
Yeah.
And some of them are still tough on crime guys.
Right.
They've been prison wardens and stuff. And yet they came away. One of them said, there's just no good way to kill someone.
Right.
It does something to us.
Right.
And so we can do justice without the death penalty.
Yeah. And I mean, you and I would both say on behalf of a lot of our evangelical brothers and sisters who we don't agree with, a lot of them, when it comes to capital punishment, I don't think it is coming from an unloving posture because these are the same people that say, hey, before we sit them down on the electric chair, we have to tell them about Jesus. Like we have to care about this person's soul. What would you encourage South Carolinians to do? Like what are the practical stuff? Like write your Congress, write the mayor and those sorts of things or what?
One of the starting points for me is proximity makes all the difference in the world. Like this can just feel like a big issue. And the thing is that I find that a lot of people haven't thought a lot about the death penalty, including me for a lot of my life. But the more you lean in and kind of unpack the layers, the more troubling it becomes, especially when you know people that are on death row, when you know people that are innocent. I mean, this is the thing is that we now have almost 200 people that were sentenced to die that are free today because they were able to prove their innocence. And that's only ones that like by DNA or by really special circumstances have been able to prove that.
So there's got to be more.
But the track record on that would be for every 8 executions that we've had 1 exoneration. Yeah. So 1 wrongful conviction that's now out. I mean, if you imagine if every like 9 planes that took off, 1 crashed, you're like, man. So there's a lot of conservatives that are kind of concerned about how much we trust imperfect governmental systems with this irreversible power. Right. My friend Derek Jameson was 20 years on death row, had 6 execution dates, 3 hours from his execution. And then eventually they were forced to release all the evidence and they knew he was in 34 pieces of evidence proved his innocence. And he is free now. But
there were people that knew that.
There's so many stories like that.
And see him get killed.
Yeah. I mean, and there's cases like that right now, that are pending in court. And but then there's cases of guilt, So I think like one of the stories that moved me early on was right in Georgia. A guy named Billy Neal Moore. He was guilty. I mean, he took someone's life and he was so haunted by it. He had never had any criminal history. It was a robbery that kind of went bad and he wanted to kill himself. He said, he tried to kill himself in prison. He said, I would have pushed the button on my own execution if I could. But then there was an interruption and it came from the victim's family that said, we hate what you did, but we're Christians. We believe in grace and second chances, redemption. And so we're going to argue against the death penalty. And they did. He fell in love with Jesus. He got baptized on death row. And this is really an exceptional case, but he is free. Not only is he free, but he's a pastor.
Wow.
And when he preaches grace, he preaches redemption, So I think that all that to say, I mean, it's really important because it's not just about, I mean, in one sense, we believe at the heart of our faith is we all deserve death.
Right.
And Jesus, gave us life. And then how the ability to then believe that someone else is defined by the worst thing that they've ever done.
Yeah.
Rather than like where sin abounds, grace abounds. Jesus said, I've come not for the healthy, but for the sick, like that. That's what we believe. So I hope that it'll change. And the good news is that overwhelmingly, we're seeing changes even in the church. Like 80% of millennial Christians are against the death penalty, right? When Americans were asked, would Jesus be in favor of the death penalty? This is a good one. 95% said, no, Jesus wouldn't be in favor of the death penalty. He interrupted an execution, right, of a woman in adultery. And yet, like, they said, we just got to convince the Christians, right, to be
I'm surprised at those numbers.
Yeah,
I think that shows I'm just so seeped into evangelical culture, because I bet you if you just surveyed the evangelicals, it would be a much lower number.
Well, there's a generational gap too, you know. Yeah. But we need to be active, because this is the moment. You know, this is the moment that it's a battleground here in South Carolina. So writing the legislators and the governor, especially the pardon and parole boards, you know, like board members, all of these folks. Like I would be surprised if almost all of them are probably Christians. You know, I would be surprised otherwise. You know, so the governor, and I think we need to be writing as Christians, talking about why our faith lends us to believe that a firing squad's not the best we can do. Right? Like, we are worshiping an executed Savior. We should have a little suspicion about state violence, right? And that's what's interesting in the early church is like they were unilaterally appalled by execution, because everything that Jesus did was expose the systems of death and hatred and violence and subvert them with love. So anyway, let's do this thing, you know, and I'll be praying for y'all here in South Carolina. We'll likely be down here with South Carolinians for alternatives to the death penalty if they do move forward with executions. It's happening all over our country, though. You know, I mean, we're even rethinking. There's federal legislation around federal executions that were reignited under Trump after 20 years without them, and so we're trying to end it once and for all. Yeah, and I really think that, you know, a generation from now we'll look back on the death penalty like our generation looks back on slavery and
I think so.
You know, so this is a time to have courage.
Yeah, I think so. All right, so we can wrap it up here. It's funny because my friend who Preston Sprinkle wrote wrote a whole book basically on nonviolence, and we've had this conversation before, and he's just like, Joey, everybody uses this example, but it's like it never happens. But the age-old example, someone walks into your house with a gun and threatens your family. Like, if it came between my daughter being killed or a bad guy being killed, and it's up to me, like it's in my power to choose, I'm going to choose the bad guy. And I think to myself, and I'm using that word bad guy loosely, I think to myself, there's definitely moral situations when both ways of handling it isn't ideal, but there's one lesser of the evils. And I would say I am commanded by God to love both of them, my daughter as well as the bad guy. What does love look like for both of them? I'm not sure if I can act accordingly and show both of them love. It seems like love for my daughter would be, hey, she's a minor, she's on my watch, I've showed her whole life that I love her and will protect her. It seems like the way to love her would be to protect her life no matter what, which would mean if there's a bad guy threatening her life, then I would need to take care of his life or do something probably violent in nature to keep him from messing with her. Like, I know it's the most trite example, but bottom line is it could happen to someone like me. Like, what would be your instructions for someone, Shane? If this happens tonight, what do I do?
Oh, man. Well, the first thing that pops in my head is there's a really interesting book. It's called Is There No Other Way? I think it's by Michael Nagler. And it shows how we have all of our brains are conditioned for fight or flight, you know, but the most effective thing is a third way. Yeah. But it's not how our brains instinctively are wired. And he goes through all these scenarios that are many of them just like the one that you came up with. And, tells true stories of how violence has been subverted, you know? Having said that, like, I have no idea how I would respond to every hypothetical situation, but I hope that I would have internalized Jesus enough that that's what comes out of me. I'm hoping,
Yeah.
you know,
Yeah.
and the fact is that I really think Jesus meant it when he said that greater love is no person than this than to lay down their life for another. That's the greatest we can do.
Yeah.
I think the moment that we try to use violence to fight violence, we actually detour a little bit from the path of Jesus.
Yeah.
And it still can be courageous. It still can be, a drivenness to protect someone we love. But I think that Jesus, when he said, love your enemies, meant we shouldn't kill them.
Yeah.
Jesus, when he shows us that this is the greatest that love can do, love can die, but it cannot kill. That's at least my, like how, and what I'm aspiring to,
Right.
you know?
Right.
And I think, the classic case was when Peter picked up a sword to protect Jesus. And I think he had that same love that you've got for your daughter.
Right.
He had for the Messiah, for this is
Right.
God in the flesh, you know? And so he picked up a sword to protect him. And of course, Jesus's response is, incredible and important,
Right.
you know, that he scolds Peter and says, no,
Right.
you pick up the sword, you die by the sword. Like this is not the solution. Put it away. And then he heals the guy that Peter wounded. And the early Christians, you know, they said when Jesus disarmed Peter, he disarmed every one of us. If ever there was a case for using violence to protect the innocent, Peter had it. So I Cyprian, he was a bishop, you know, in the early days of the church. And he said, when an individual kills another individual, we know it's evil, but we sanctify it when the state does it in mass. So going back to death penalty, Cyprian would say, it's wrong to kill, no matter whether it's done by a criminal or by a governor. And most of all, someone who's claiming to follow Jesus, like we cannot justify that kind of violence.
Yeah.
So, so I think that's my hope is that we would have a better ethic of life and to be pro-life. There's nothing pro-life about the death penalty. There's nothing pro-life about the firing squad. And I think what we can say is killing is wrong, period.